Happy Election Day, everybody out there in the U.S. Big day in history. Yeah, it's been about 3 or 4 weeks. I'm going to be doing this every first Tuesday of each month, and possibly going over a little bit. But anyways, it's good to see or have all of you back. Right. So one of the first questions is, what other elements have to be considered other than volume regarding paddling and catching waves, like rocker, rail configurations, foil, etc.? That's a good question, because right now everybody's hung up on volume. You can have two boards the same volume, but they'll paddle completely differently. They'll ride differently, and I'm glad this question was asked, because it's all that people seem to focus on these days is volume. If you're a competitive surfer or a very advanced surfer and you have your equipment dialed in, you know exactly what you want. That's one thing. Still, you won't be able to feel much, probably not less than half a liter. But so first off, let's talk about rocker. Rocker is going to, and once again, I'm going to say this probably every time. If you have a design question, you can probably answer most of the questions yourself by saying, well, what if I had a board with a ton of rocker, and what if I had a board with no rocker? And which one would paddle faster? And there you have the shaper's, I'm going to say shaper's dilemma, but that's the shaper's job, is to find that happy medium somewhere, maybe not on, not too extreme on the plus side, not too extreme on the minus side, but that's one of the attributes of a fish. That's definitely an attribute of like the 84 that has the original ones had pretty low entry rockers and lowish tail rockers, and they definitely caught waves easier. They paddled faster, and even today when people get those boards that look back, primarily before Kelly came on the scene. Kelly had a huge impact on the industry 30 years ago. Before that, the boards had a fair bit of rocker, but they still kind of were a little bit thicker, and a lot of them had beaks coming into the late 80s. But Kelly changed all that. So back to rocker. Your retro boards, all things being the same, if they have a similar template to a modern board, simply because they're a little bit flatter, are going to catch waves easier, and you can still get pretty good performance out of them. Rail configurations, that's another thing that affects paddling and catching waves. I've always liked slightly lower apex than most shapers. On the average, if you put a square on the bottom of a board and you measure up, it'll have contact at about 7/10 of an inch. 7/10 of an inch on average. I tend to be a touch lower, but that, in my mind, that makes the rail more efficient. The water releases quicker, and the rail sets quicker. Then, if you have a softer rail, it's more forgiving, it's more neutral, it's more roly-poly, it doesn't set as quick, unless you have a board very low volume, and you put the whole rail in the water. hang on this. Excuse me a second. You guys are fun. Shut the door. All right, back. Yeah, so softer rails. I've never really liked them. I went through a period in the early '70s where I was riding a lot of eggs, and they had more neutral rails. But so rail, a firmer lower rail will help catch waves. And probably one of the most important things is the area, the surface area of the bottom of the board, or the surface area of the board. And that's why on the alternative boards you can go 2 to 4, 5, 6 inches shorter, because they have lower rocker. They have a lot more area. Usually the rails are a little bit lower and they're a little bit fuller. And it's careful. You have to be careful when you talk about fuller rails. Like a lot of people think, well, just because it's full at the top, as the rail comes down, from towards the top down towards the apex. I personally don't like, even on my flat deck boards, I don't like a lot of curve in here. I make it more angular, and then you hit the apex and it goes down. And the reason is with the thickness of the top of the rail, it's a little bit more difficult to set the rail. In one aspect, harder to get the whole rail in the water, but you get with the bit taken out of the area just above the apex, you can set your rail, and it'll set quicker and it'll release quicker. So volume. I'm gonna preach about it every time I'm on, but there's so many other factors: the rocker, the area, the rails, and the bottom contours too. I mean, a convex bottom is typically speaking a slower bottom because it tends to disperse the water, spread it out away from the board, and the concave tends to keep the water under the board. And so concaves within I think when a concave gets deeper than like 0.3 inches, it's like maybe it's okay for really small, weak waves, but it just generates so much energy and it becomes so twitchy that I think most bottoms live in the 0.15 to the 0.25 at the deepest point with a concave or a double concave. And there's a place for convex bottoms, and I think bigger, wider boards, boards that you need some help getting rail to rail on, like we've got a new bottle that it's new but it's old. We're calling it the egg, lowercase e, uppercase GG, but I've been making eggs for almost 50 years, and this is just a newer version, and it's got a little bit more tail rocker than a traditional egg. Similar lower nose entry. It has a very light convex bottom in the center, and a little bit of release up front, and a moderate double V through the back third of the board. And it is a little bit thinner. So with the rocker and the bottom contour and having it be a little bit thinner, it's meant to be a loose board and fun. But even fins. I'm still stuck kind of on the first comment or question. What other elements? Your fins. I found that 4 fins slip into the waves a little bit quicker than 3 fins, and definitely quicker than a single fin. It's just the way the forefins are set up. They want to really generate lift, and they want to run parallel to the wave's energy, whereas the tri-fin wants to run perpendicular to the wave's energy. But I think you get a little bit of extra paddling speed out of quads. So that's, and the last thing, the balance point and the thickness is very important too. A lot of surfers tend to like or think they like a little bit thicker tail than the nose, but I find that more balanced boards paddle more efficiently. How important is the flex on a surfboard? Gosh, the first few boards, I had in the late 60s, early 70s, mainly the late 60s. Flex wasn't really, in my program, wasn't really something I thought about much. And but flex is super important, especially on a smaller wave board, because when you turn, when you lean over, when you press your rail in the water, you are basically, you're flexing the board. You're actually adding more rocker, and you're tightening the arc of your turn to come up the face. And then if you lean on it on the way back down, it tightens the arc again. And then when you release your weight, the board straightens out a little bit back more towards its natural rocker, and it gives you, a good, small to medium wave board will give you a spring out of a turn too. And it's noticeable. Different constructions, like pro surfers generally they kind of have a board budget, but at the same time, you want to experiment and make your boards better and better. And usually the pro riders are the ones that give you good feedback. That's not to say that advanced recreational surfer can't give you great feedback as well, even an intermediate surfer. But flex is very important. And the pro surfers, they get very light polyurethane foam usually, and but the difference is in their glass shops. You usually get like single 4 top and bottom, maybe with a 4 deck patch. And their boards are very light. They don't last that long. In fact, they put them in the best ones. They put in storage until the next event or next important surf they have. But the average person, if you get a PE board, polyester glass job, you'll get decent flex if the lamination is good. If the lamination is too wet, too much resin, it'll make the board heavier, it'll make it stiffer. If you get it too light and there's air in it, it'll perform great, but it probably won't last that long. And then there's the epoxy resin, which has different flex characteristics, and you can glass any type of foam with epoxy. And in the last few years, it's really there's been a lot of nice surfboard specific epoxies developed that stay clear or stay white, and they have great flex characteristics. They have great memory, and I think epoxy is the future. It's like some surfboard companies embrace, I believe, all epoxy glassing. But eventually polyester resin, it'll either become slow controlled or outlawed. But it doesn't cost that much extra to get epoxy, and it's got a better flex pattern. And then you can also glass EPS, which will be lighter and twitchier. It'll be, the flex will be good if you're riding kind of smoother, smaller, cleaner waves. When it gets bumpy, it feels a little bit twitchy. And then there's the expanded polystyrene, or the extruded polystyrene, the XPS, which is polystyrene foam, but it's made differently. It's instead of the beads starting out as small beads and being expanded into a chamber or a blank mold, the beads are actually melted and then extruded, pushed through a loader, for whatever better word, and instead of being random little tight cells, but still there's waterways through the EPS. The extruded foam comes from the building industry, and it's designed to be waterproof, and it is. And I think one of the reasons it wasn't used earlier is because it was color-coded blue or red, and but there's sources of white extruded styrofoam now, and I believe that's the ultimate. You got a waterproof blank that's maybe a touch lighter than polyurethane. You can get polyurethane in different weights, and you can get EPS in different weights, and the XPS you can get in different weights, but on the average, an XPS board will weigh a little bit more than an EPS core, but it'll weigh less than a PU core. And part of that has to do with the epoxy resin. So this is all flex. I'm not rambling. Sounds like I might be rambling off on a construction thing, but the construction has a huge impact on your flex. And you want, I mean, for the most part, you want flex, decent, good, quick flex, quick rebound flex for small to medium-sized surf. As you get in the bigger, more powerful surf, I personally don't think flex is a good thing. Maybe a little tiny bend in the board when you do a turn, but the arcs are so big that you're concerned more about controlling your speed and your position, and therefore, I remember surfing out at Lani Kea once with MR and a host of other great surfers, and it was a solid 8-foot day. And I remember he was riding a 6'10" or 7'2" or something, and he would drop in on the set waves in kind of a crouch, and then straighten his whole body out, and with the board on rail, and I swear I could see the board bending at the peak of his turn, and then it would start coming up the face, and he'd start to crouch back down and release the board. But that's kind of rare. But you can see all the great, especially great younger surfers of these times. Boards that really flex, they get under them, they release, and maybe alternative boards like fishy things. Maybe not as much flex, a little bit flatter. They're meant to be ridden a little bit flatter anyways. I think, and thickness has a lot to do with flex too. When I first started making boards with flatter decks and then flat decks in the early to mid 80s, in order to keep the volume in line, if you took, another shaper's board with a crown deck and, thinner rails, and it was 27 liters in volume, 6'1", 18 and a half, and, 2 3/8, if I made a flat neck board, I would have to make it about 0.2 to a full quarter of an inch thinner to have the same volume. And when you're writing a thinner board, your two surfaces are closer together, and the board will flex more. Once again, you imagine extremes. If you have a board that's an inch thick, it's going to be bending all over the place. If it's 2 inches thick, it'll still be bending a fair bit. If it's 3 inches thick, it's not going to bend much. And if it's 3.5 inches, you're lucky if you get a little bit of tweak out of a turn. So yeah, that's one of the great things about the flat deck series. I have people trip on them because they paddle well, but they're very alive in the water. And so yeah, your thickness, the construction, the amount of cloth, the type of resin you use, your thickness, your foil, all of those things affect flex on the board. How does weight affect the way a board rides? How does weight affect the way a board rides? Well, I mean, once again, people get absorbed with volume, and they get obsessed with gosh, I really think I really need to go 0.2 liters less. And there are so many other factors on a surfboard that I could tweak, and the board would ride completely differently to feel it. But the weight of a surfboard, we actually, in the early days of EPS, we made super light boards for wave pools and small waves. And they weighed 4.5, 4.75 pounds. And the surfers, the pros that rode them, or the surfers that rode them, they asked for the boards to be a little bit heavier than normal, just to bring the weight up to 5, 5.25, 5 3/8 pounds. I think for small medium waves, small to medium small waves, weight is very important. And I use this in my volume blog. 5% volume change is about 1.5 liters on an average shortboard. 5% weight, call it 10%. Your board goes from, say, 6.25 to 5.75. That's pretty noticeable on the way the board rides and how it feels. And as you start to ride bigger waves, weight, it's not, you don't write off, you just don't discount the weight, but it's not as important to have a light board. And in bigger waves and really big boards, I think first they need big stringers, to keep the board from flexing and breaking. And I glass the big boards, say over, for sure 9 foot and up. I glass them double 6 bottom and 6/4 top, because you're not catching that many waves, and the board is more bottom weighted. Your center of gravity is lower, and it's the guys that build boards like JoJo and Jamie Sterling, and occasionally Garrett McNamara and so forth. They actually like, they want heavier boards, and they actually like the bottom weighted boards. It's subtle. It's not. It's noticeable, but it's subtle. And so yeah, and when you pick up two 260s, same dimensions, and you pick one up out of polyurethane, and it's 6 pounds, and then you pick up one that is made out of EPS, 10% lighter, it's going to be in the low 5s, and that's very noticeable. Um, how the weight, let me see. Harder rails have more bite and drive. Softer or easier to surf and don't catch but lack a drive. How do you find the right way? How do you find the right rail? I touched on that earlier. It's like, every shaper, although we don't really have much wiggle room, every shaper on a, say, a performance shortboard has not much wiggle room on the apex, which is the farthest, it's the point that's the farthest out, and then it drops back down. And, as I said, I tend to be anywhere from the low, point, 6.3 or 4 or something like that, up to maybe 0.7. And the reason is I feel they're more efficient. They just, they get them and they lift quicker. They're easier to set. They're quicker to set in your turns, and they release quicker. I think really soft rails are, I don't want to say they're a thing left over from the past, but they've they're cool for certain models, like longboards, mini tankers, eggs, kind of longer, small wave specialty boards. Change of fins. Change your fins, change your board. For the average surfer, and sometimes even advanced, it's pretty hard to know, especially what fins to try. Fins are so important. Once you get your skill level to a certain, once you get your skill level to a certain height or whatever you call it, ability, it's okay if you start out on plastic fins. I always said friends don't let friends ride plastic fins, and I've been saying that for decades. Ever since FCS came out with their first plastic fins, and the things were so soft and spongy, but they did such a strong marketing push, most of the world was riding them, and then there was a slight push back to glass-ons because people realized that glass-ons had much crisper flex. And then Futures came along, and pretty soon everybody was working on composite fins, and they're a lot more. But the flex patterns and the foils and the templates don't vary much. You can have a little less rake, a little more rake, but the thickness of the fins is fairly consistent. But the foil, the apex, you have a flat side to the fin. Sometimes the flat side has like a light concave or whatever, and but the rounded surface, the outside surface, usually the thickest point, that can move forward, back. It can be closer to the center, or it can be farther forward, more towards the leading edge, and that has a lot to do with the looseness of the turn, the amount of lift. And I generally found that the apex was closer to the leading edge of the fin. It had more drive, it had more outright speed, whereas as you move the apex back towards the middle, the board is maybe arguably looser and maybe a touch more lift, but not as much drive. And then the thickness of the tip, how the fin thins out as it goes towards the tip. And I always liked fins that had a graduated flex. They're kind of stiff in the bottom third and bent a little bit in the middle, and then the top third of the fin had some flex and torque too, not just lateral flex, but it has some twist or torque to it, which gives you a little bit of extra kick out of your turns. And a beginning surfer is not going to feel that. A beginning surfer is just struggling to learn to make turns and make waves and, hopefully have fun. But if you want your surfing to progress, every time I've had an old friend or a new customer, whoever, who has never really paid attention to the fins, I recommend a certain template and a certain composition to the fins, and they come back and they go, oh my God, it's a whole new board. It's a different board. And I go, yeah. You imagine spending whatever you spend on a car, but you don't pay attention to the tires. It's like, kidding me? So, yeah, I used to be so into fins. I kind of repeating myself here, but I started out shaping next to Skip Fry at GNS in the early 70s, and Skip's boards were different. He wrote sanded finishes like glass jobs. Most of the industry was still into glosses, and his fins, he kept a box of fins in his car, all different heights, rakes, bases, area. And I go, oh, sorry, those are all different conditions. And I embraced his thinking, and it wasn't long before I had a box of 10 fins in the back of my truck. And that's the beauty of having boxes in your board. Glass-ons, if you get a board with the right set of fins and they're glassed on by somebody that knows what they're doing, they'll feel good. But I think composite fins have come so far that I have a good friend that has been kind of freaking on glass-ons lately, but that's just lately. And they're actually a 20-year-old set of Curtis Hesselgrave fins with a light inside foil. I had a few sitting around, and he wanted to try them. But fins are so important to your board. With that being said, most fins, as I said earlier, have about the same rake. Some are rakier, and some are straighter up and down. Most people consider medium-sized fins like 4.5, maybe give or take a little bit. Larger fins are 4 5/8, 4.65 to 4.7, and smaller fins are 4.4, 4.35. And the rear fins on a quad I like 4 inches. I think smaller, you push through the water and you don't get as much lift and drive out of them. So I like, and 4 1/4 and 4 3/8 on a rear quad rear fin is too much. So I personally think 4 inches is the go. And then you can mix fins. The beauty of having a box is you can change your fins, different flex patterns, different rake, and so forth. And you can, if you know a fin maker, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to know somebody at Futures or SCS, but if you know there's guys out there that make fins, you can try different layups. Like typically in production, people want to take the shortcut, so they use very heavy cloth. So it only takes a few layers to make a fin the proper thickness. 8 ounces. 6 ounces is pretty good, but I was always looking for something better. And Skip taught me this too. We would get 4 ounce layups, and a 6 ounce sheet might have 18, 20 layers. A 4 ounce sheet has 30 layers. 30% more. And then there's a material. It's an epoxy pressed sheet. A very, 3.5 ounce cloth, and it's pressed. It's in a heat press with epoxy resin called G10, And a friend of mine, Elliot Raymond, his father had started a plastic business, and Elliot and I made surfboards even before G&S days. But I had him get me some G10, and I had my favorite fin guy back in the day make me some fins. And I mean, those are single fins, but when the tri-fin thing came around a few years after, I tried some G10 fins, and those things are timeless. The composite fins are lighter. They're very light. In fact, some of them almost don't weigh anything. And some team riders like that feeling. But the G10s, they're a little bit heavier, but they're not in a bad way. But the flex and the way they go through the water, it's just unbelievable. And so, yeah, fins it's something we don't talk much about, and probably because most people don't know much about fins. But you like I said, if you're intermediate, you should probably consider getting composite fins, and if you're advanced, if you're not riding composite fins, you're crazy. This is an interesting question. Hi, Garth. This is an interesting comment or question. There is a trend to move the thickness forward on shortboards. Does that make the board heavier on the maneuvers? Good question. Good, and this goes back to the balance of the board. I've always, as long as I can remember, I've always liked a balanced foil. You have the center, and then as you move away from the center, I mean, I used to measure every 6 inches, but 12 inches from the nose and 12 inches from the tail. It's pretty typical for most shapers these days to have a nose that is thinner. When Wade Carmichael first started riding for us, his boards are almost a 1/4 inch thicker in the tail, and over time he's still a little thicker in the tail, but nowhere near a 1/4 inch. And I think, I've always, if anything, I've always been a foil forward kind of guy, and I think that a thinner tail flexes better for starts. The thinner your tail is, the more it's going to flex, but if it's too thin, it's going to sink and you'll overpower it and blah, blah, blah. If a nose is too thin, the board's not really going to have much momentum. And I think the way guys are surfing these days, half the time they're up in the air. I think they'd want balanced boards so that the boards would stay under their feet better. I think they'd spin easier. If you have a board that's heavily weighted at one end or the other, it's not going to, it'll maybe go halfway through a spin or something, I don't know. But it's, so I think the comment of the question was, does it make the board heavier on maneuvers? I'm not sure what heavier means, but if the board's balanced, I think it'll tend to stay under your feet easier. If the foil is forward, you'll arguably be able to paddle more efficiently, catch waves a little bit easier. You'll have more momentum out of turns. Like some of the boards I make for guys that surf more like point break or longer lined up waves. I definitely have the front half a little bit thicker, and that kind of ties into the rails too. I've always found that the thickest point of the rails really needs to be definitely at center or above center a touch. Why? Personal experiences. I took some boards to Fiji once that had the thickest part of the rail slightly behind center. The board is loose. It would, kind of squirt out of turns, but it would die quickly. I mean, just the water flow along the rail line. It would, the thicker rail in the aft part of the board would bog. The thickness for it, Shane Horan, I don't know if many of you remember him, but he was adamant about writing single fins with very narrow noses. Nose and tail difference is probably 3.5, 4 inches in width. And thickness too. His noses were fairly heavily rockered, but kind of thin, and his tails, I made Shane some boards back in the day, and I had to, shape his 6'2" out of a 7'4" to get the tail thickness that he wanted. And Shane was a brilliant surfer. I think he was runner-up for the world title like 3 years. Probably the best surfer to have never won one. But his turns were very short. They're very tight. They're very in the pocket. And, Aki, on the other hand, he rode the flatter deck boards with the foil a little bit forward. And every turn was a freaking laid out rail turn. And, and he'd get to where he'd want to go, and he'd slam on the brakes and then do it again. And basically on all the models I do, as I said, I very rarely have a shift of more than 1/8 of an inch. And, I feel that, once again, that's a part of the balance. The basis of a lot of my shaping theory comes from balance. And the nose width too, that ties into this thickness thing. I look at boards I posted one on Instagram a few weeks ago of one of Taylor's boards from 1991, and the whole thing was narrow, but the nose is like close to 3 inches, almost 3 inches narrower than the tail. And over time, the noses have become fuller. And I know in most of my designs, over a 2-inch difference. A 1-inch difference, that's kind of more of an alternative vibe. 1.5 to 1 3/4 narrower is a good. It's a good width difference, and most of my models, whether or not they're based on team riders' needs or what, but they are more along that 1 3/4, give or take a touch difference. So that ties into the thickness thing too, especially the air guys that, which most surfers are these days. They like a little bit more up under their front foot, especially for landings, a little bit more thickness, a little bit more area. Let me see what else we got. This is an interesting question. The best novice shortboard for 2 to 5 foot surf. Um, my advice to a novice surfer is I do pretty much all custom orders these days, and when I get down to it and I get to get a little bit more information out of surfers, it turns out that quite a few are, I call it the pyramid, where the top of the pyramid's the advanced, the pros, and as you go down, the pyramid gets wider and there's more, and obviously the base of the pyramid is novice or beginner. And I think one very common mistake for a novice or beginner is, most of the time they start out on a soft molded 9-foot board or an 8/6 board that's 23 inches and change wide and 3.5 inches thick and a very full template. The biggest mistake that they all make is they think, oh man, I got this surfing thing down. I want to get a cool looking short board, and they jump down to a 6.0 SD or something, and I just go, ah. And some of them are adamant about it, but they know more than I do, so they stick to their guns. But I feel that as a novice or beginner, you probably shouldn't bite off more than 6 inches at a time, possibly 12 if you're on a 9-foot board and you're a lighter surfer. You can jump down to an 8-foot board. But if you jump down to too short of a board, you're going to hurt your progress. You're going to get frustrated. You're not going to catch that many waves. And excuse me, I think for most of us, surfing is about having a good time and catching. If you catch one wave a session, to me, that's frustrating. If I catch 10 waves in a session, that's pretty good. If I catch 20, that's epic. But and as a beginner or a novice, you can keep this bigger board, call it a mid-range or mid-length, whatever you want to call it, in between board. You can keep it the rest of your surfing career. And if you, when the time comes and you feel like you need to advance on, heck, save that board. Save it for smaller days. Save it for weaker days. I got a lot of good surfers that, they typically ride pretty low volume boards, but they have a fun board in their quiver. And so a novice shortboard, say you're 170 pounds, if you're, depending on what your level is, if you're just learning to go straight, stick with definitely a bigger board. If you're learning to turn and starting to go up and down and maybe starting to get cutbacks a little bit figured out, 170 pounds, maybe 7.6, 7.0. And if you're doing turns, you're not doing airs yet. You're not even, you might be attempting airs, but you're doing turns, maybe a 6.6. And as I said, that's a board you'll have fun on small days for the rest of your surfing career. And a lot of and keep in mind that you want a fuller template. The narrower especially the middle is, but the narrower the nose and tail are, it's the less, it's back to that area thing where you have stability and wave catching, ease of wave catching with a little bit more surface area. So, the fishy type boards, the egg type boards, the boards that have at least a 14.5, 15 inch wide nose and a similar tail and, 21.5, 22 wide. That, in my mind, is a good small wave board for all of the novices and the beginners out there. I was cracking out some of these posts. You are currently designing my 10.5 gun for Chile. Need lots of paddle power for the South Pacific raw energy. You get, the guns. People think, oh, guns need to be really narrow, but actually, is a board. The boards do get narrower. The guns, the semi guns, do get narrower, up to 7.4, 7.6. Around 7.6, 7.8, they start to get wider, just because you need to maintain the outline curve. Otherwise, the board, the template starts to become too parallel. And, most 9-foot guns are 21 inches wide, give or take a little bit. 9.6, 21 and a half. 10 foot and over, it's 22 and up. And they're, an 8-foot gun might be close to 3 inches thick. 8.6 is going to be 3 and change, and a 9-foot gun is most likely going to be 3 and 1/8, probably closer to 3 1/4, 3 and 3/8. And then the monster boards, it's game on. But yeah, your board should paddle. All right, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. Lower the camera. Whoop. How's that? Is that better? Kevin Schultz. What happened to Kevin Schultz? Well, I'll just be brief on this. I sold the clothing company in 2006, and I stayed pretty involved with it for about 5 years. But over time, I've drifted away, and I really don't I make decisions regarding surfboards. But as far as an overall sponsorship package, some athletes come and go, and there's been a lot of instances where guys have come up up through the ranks on our boards and clothing or whatever, and then we've had a lot of surfers that have cracked the top 5, and then they start looking for big money, and I can't blame them. And at one time, we were a big enough company to where we could, I think CJ is the highest paid athlete we ever had, and I'm not going to discuss how much, but Kevin, I love Kevin. I love working with him. He was easy, great guy, but he was doing quite well and getting a lot of attention, publicity, and the powers that be that run the clothing business. He got a better offer from somebody else, and their careers are short, and if we can't pony up, we can always pony up with equipment. I'm confident we can pony up with the boards, but I love Kevin, and I wish him nothing but the best. Please, we need help with surfing. Please, we need help with surfing. I'm not going to go there tonight. 500-yard long left point. I've been blessed to, in years, not so much lately, but years past, to travel a lot, partially for business, but partially for fun. And I'm goofy foot, and I got a lot of waves checked off my list, but there's a couple along west that I haven't ridden, and I'd like to ride, but I might be a little bit too old for them. But yeah, 500 yard long. You know, Indo, I've ridden ways that are a couple hundred yards long, and Africa, I've ridden a wave that's several hundred yards long, but 500 yards long, that's, yeah, that, if I had my last wishes, it'd be to get on a left that went forever. What's he call it? It's important to get kids boards. Kids boards. I get a lot of fathers that grew up on my boards or aware of my boards that now have kids, and they're for instance, I'm building one for a 5-year-old right now, and his dad is very involved in the design of the kid's very first surfboard. He wants his kid to hang with him and surf with him, and I think once again, especially with little kids. My little boy's 33 now, 34, and my daughter's right behind them. And I started them out when they were very small, and I made 4.5-foot surfboards that were 16 and change wide, and but kids boards. I'm all about kids boards. I make a lot of sub 5-foot boards, but it's something that we don't. We probably could spend more attention to it on our website, but I've got a lot of experience making kids boards, and if you'd email us, we'd be happy to talk about kids boards. One interesting fact is people go, well, they're only half as big. They should probably cost half as much. But certainly there's a little bit less materials involved, but it's almost harder to work on a board that's in the low fives, and definitely harder to work on a board that's in the 4.6 to 5-foot range. It's not really any easier than it is working on a 6-foot board. I always get a kick out of holding up a 5-foot board between my fingertips. Call the Godowskis brothers. I know. I kind of know the Godowskis brothers, but I know their father quite well. He actually took my wife out a couple times before she was my wife some 35 years ago. Tom used to be a rep in the industry. Great guy. Godfather. Getting running out of time here. I'm gonna. Do you have any more info about the shiv? The shiv was basically the SD, definitely the SD bottom, but I thinned it out, 0.2, 0.23 inches, and gave it a flat deck, and pulled the tail in slightly. I think it's a great performance board, but we've gotten some interest on it. Typically, the people that are interested in flat deck boards are either more alternative fishy shapes, wider outlines overall, or kind of a retro board like the Blade or the 84. But the shiv is, for those of you that are willing to try a flat deck, I think in terms of performance, it's probably our highest performance flat deck board, and it's gaining in popularity, but slowly. But if you're out there and you're thinking about another board, think hard about the shiv. It's a good board. Plenty of rocker, deep concave especially through the sweet spot. Okay, last question. Why do pro surfers prefer mostly PU boards? Because they can get them glassed as light as they want. They go back in the early days, in the early '80s. All my team guys, Aki used to get 6 or 8, maybe 10 boards a year. Now they get 10 boards for every contest, and if I made a civilian a board that's glass like it's for a pro, you'd have to sign a waiver or something that says, I understand this board might hold up one session. So there are more pro surfers riding e-poly, and some of them have EPS boards in their quiver. There's for the small days, and some of them have experimented with extruded styrofoam. But surfers are conservative people. They say they like change, they say they like progress, they say they like moving forward, but at the same time, they kind of hang on to what they know. So I think a lot of it's, why do they prefer PU boards? A lot of it's because they can get all the boards they want, and 2, it's what they know. But as all things do, I think things will change over time. That was a quick hour. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you. A month seems like a long time. Maybe I'll do it every 2 weeks. But anyways, thanks for joining me, and have a good night.